Last year, we took a look at F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, the classic silent film interpretation of the popular novel Dracula. While the rights issues led to the film nearly being wiped from existence, during its time in cinemas, those audience members that got a chance to see it were captivated with its impressive cinematography, effects, atmosphere, and the image of the vampire himself, Count Orlok. Orlok was the true shocker, a complete 180 from the suave Dracula to the monstrous creature that stalked the beautiful heroine. His visage was inhuman, his teeth were like that of some vermin, and his claw-like fingers an inspiration for artists over the next century. The image of his shadow climbing the stairs, an iconic moment of terror. As if to prove life can sometimes be too on the nose, the actor who played the monster was Max Schreck, whose name in German means fright. Schreck appeared in other works, but was such an iconic figure, with such an obviously fitting name, acting so absolutely inhuman. You can certainly understand why some people wondered if, maybe, just maybe, Max Schreck was exactly what he appeared to be. That Murnau had somehow found an actual vampire and struck some kind of a bargain, likely of the unholy kind, to star in this picture. This long-running, not sure who's serious and who's joking about it myth finally reached its culmination with Stephen Katz. If you're not familiar with Nosferatu, here's a few things to be aware of before we continue. First, it was intended to be an occult film. The producer, Grau, worked to incorporate as much of that in as possible. Second, for that reason, Orlok's shadow was present without the Count himself to represent a projection of his power, to show that Orlok was literally a creature of shadows, and is the reason why vampires in modern lore are destroyed by sunlight. It originates with this concept that shadows are destroyed by the daylight. Third, Murnau was a genius, and while there is reason to include this film as German Expressionism, his ability to eschew many elements of Expressionism, such as by finding a way to draw the appearance of the unnatural out of nature, rather than through confined sets, showed he wasn't confined to a single box. And finally, the film frequently employed dream logic rather than reality in its storytelling, such as plague-filled soil being represented by dirt filled with rats. Shadow of the Vampire was the first script Katz worked on creating, back in the late 80s, which got him an agent to help his entry into work in Hollywood scriptwriting. The strength of Shadow of the Vampire got him the opportunity to do what must have been a vampire fan's dream, adapting Anne Rice's script of Interview with the Vampire to something that'd work as a movie. But after completion, the new director rewrote that script himself, and Katz's role in that was forgotten. Disheartened and disappointed that the final Interview with the Vampire didn't seem anything special, he went back and reworked his Shadow of the Vampire script to try to make it a truly great vampire film. The script came to the attention of Nicolas Cage, who had been inspired to become an actor because of Max Schreck, and he was very interested in playing that character. He also considered playing Murnau, and at one point considered playing both characters. But when asked, Katz said that he envisioned Schreck being played by Willem Dafoe. As for Murnau, Cage had liked working with John Malkovich in Con Air and felt that he could capture the character perfectly. To have two names like that as the leads in this film, and Nicolas Cage, whose star power was high at this time, serving as the executive producer, was a dream for a personal project like this. But for Katz, that would change around the time the director was brought in, E. Elias Merhige. Merhige shows either the influence or the kindred spirit of Murnau in his own filmmaking, as a quote in 2013 in Fangoria shows. I started to see dream reality and the reality of the physical world as mirrors of each other. Outside of this work, considered mainstream for the most part, was his 1989 film The Begotten, which showed the influence of classic silent films with terrifying imagery, and is simultaneously a cult film even by cult film standards, yet one that, if you do know of it, winds up on your top 10 list. Marriage's work is not straightforward, and when one sees the steps that he took to make this film, that much should be obvious. Katz wanted, after what he felt were disappointments with Interview with the Vampire and Bram Stoker's Dracula, to make the godfather of vampire films. But with an experimental filmmaker like Marriage at the helm, and artists like Cage and Malkovich on the production, they wanted to take it in a different direction. And while one can obviously feel for Katz over this, it was for the best. And as consolation, he would receive the Bram Stoker Award for writing this film. Tim Burton's indescribably wonderful biopic Ed Wood had come out a few years earlier to look at the life of someone generally considered the worst director of all time, whose life went downhill and ended sadly. But instead, the film was a tale of someone who loved making movies even if he was actually terrible at it. Some have said that that is actually the closest to a biographical film that Burton had ever made. With this, the intention was to go further than Ed Wood had. This isn't meant to be an accounting of how the film was made, because Max Schreck is a human being after all. This also isn't meant to be, if he weren't a human being, if he were a vampire, then how would it have been made? That was merely the start of the idea as far as they were concerned. No, the idea was, once we have that premise of a director so insistent on perfectionism that he would hire a real vampire, and a performer so demanding that he expects to be able to suck the lifeblood of the leading lady, you are left with the cinematic irresistible force and immovable object. The intention wasn't to create a film to show the making of Nosferatu, or an Ed Wood-style fictionalized version of the making, but rather to use that premise to explore the war of egos that can sometimes be found in film productions. With Shadow of the Vampire, they were seeking to merge a biopic with horror and with commentary on artistry itself. In the fictional universe of the film, Malkovich's Murnau covers for the inhuman nature of his star by telling cast and crew that Schreck is schooled in method acting, will show up in makeup and remain in character throughout the shoot, on and off camera. His whims in this are to be indulged. The irony is that Willem Dafoe is anything but a method actor, who feels that acting is much more like a dance. Don't force it, he says, saying to react, to not sell the psychology, but to have the experience. Dafoe was thus helped along by the impressive makeup. Quote, "The makeup was everything because that became the key, that became the mask, that became the mode defined the character, because it was so extreme that it informed everything you did." Instead of researching the actor, he watched how Schreck performed Orlok to learn the physicality of the character. And it paid off. Dafoe received an Oscar nomination for his role in the film. As expected, the film did well with critics, but did mediocre box office, despite being what many consider to be Marriage's most mainstream film. Tomorrow we'll take a look at the film itself, Shadow of the Vampire.